The Indian Trade and Intercourse Acts, a historical overview. The Indian Trade and Intercourse Acts, spanning a series of laws passed between 1790 and 1834, were some of the earliest legislative attempts by the United States government to define and manage its relationship with Native American tribes. These acts sought to regulate trade, mitigate conflicts, and impose a semblance of order on the expanding frontier. While their intent may have seemed progressive for the time, their limited enforcement and the pressures of westward expansion rendered them largely ineffective in protecting Native American interests. The initial Indian Trade and Intercourse Act, passed in 1790, marked the federal government's first formal effort to manage interactions between settlers and Native Americans. It required that all trade with Native tribes be conducted under licenses issued by the federal government. The law also prohibited the purchase of native lands without the explicit approval of Congress, aiming to prevent unauthorized encroachment by settlers. In theory, the act was meant to establish respect for tribal sovereignty and protect native lands from exploitation. However, enforcement proved to be a significant challenge. The government lacked the resources to oversee vast frontier territories effectively, and settlers frequently ignored these restrictions, often seizing land by force or through coercive treaties. Over the next 4 decades, Congress passed several additional versions of the Act, each refining and expanding its provisions. These laws were designed to regulate the fur trade and prevent settlers from engaging in exploitative practices, establish Indian country boundaries, beyond which settlers were not legally allowed to reside, prevent the sale of alcohol to Native Americans, which was seen as a growing issue on the frontier. One notable provision included the establishment of Indian agents, federal officials tasked with overseeing relations between the government and Native tribes. These agents were meant to serve as intermediaries, ensuring that trade agreements were upheld and disputes resolved. However, corruption and limited oversight often hampered their effectiveness. Despite their ambitions, the Indian Trade and Intercourse Acts face systemic issues that undermine their goals. Weak federal presence. The federal government had minimal authority and resources to enforce the laws in the remote and rugged frontier regions. Military posts were sparse, and Indian agents were often outnumbered and outmaneuvered by settlers. Reluctant settlers. Many settlers viewed the laws as obstacles to their ambitions of westward expansion. Eager for land and resources, they frequently disregarded legal boundaries, leading to violent clashes with Native tribes. Conflicts of interest. The U.S. government itself was increasingly interested in westward expansion, which created a conflict between its stated goal of protecting native lands and its desire to accommodate settlers' demands. As a result, many provisions of the acts were ignored or bypassed, leaving native communities vulnerable to exploitation and displacement. By the early 19th century, the contradictions in U.S. policy became stark. While the Indian Trade and Intercourse Acts ostensibly aimed to protect native lands, they were at odds with the growing national ethos of manifest destiny, which championed the idea that westward expansion was both inevitable and divinely sanctioned. This tension became particularly evident with the passage of the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which directly contradicted the protective intent of the earlier laws. Under President Andrew Jackson's administration, Native tribes in the southeastern United States were forcibly relocated west of the Mississippi River, culminating in the tragic Trail of Tears. The Indian Trade and Intercourse Acts, which had attempted to regulate interactions and safeguard Native interests, were effectively rendered obsolete in the face of these aggressive removal policies. Though largely unsuccessful in achieving their intended goals, the Indian Trade and Intercourse Acts are significant for several reasons. Early recognition of tribal sovereignty. By attempting to regulate trade and land transactions, the acts acknowledged Native American tribes as distinct political entities with rights that the federal government was obligated to respect. Foundation for future policy. The laws set a precedent for federal involvement in Native American affairs, which would evolve into more formalized policies in the decades to come. Insight into early American attitudes. The acts reveal the tension between a fledgling nation's desire to present itself as just and fair, while simultaneously pursuing territorial expansion at the expense of Native populations. While the acts ultimately failed to protect Native lands and communities, They provide valuable insight into the complexities and contradictions of early U.S. policy toward indigenous peoples. They represent one of the first attempts to formalize relationships between the federal government and native tribes, a relationship fraught with conflict, broken promises, and systemic inequities that would persist throughout American history.